Israeli Prime Minister's office has released a statement on the resumption of the strikes in Gaza. It reads, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz have instructed the Israeli forces to take strong action against the Hamas terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip. It follows Hamas's repeated refusal to release our hostages, as well as its rejection of all the proposals it has received from U.S. Presidential Envoy Steve Witkoff and from the mediators. It says the army is attacking targets of the Hamas terrorist organization throughout the Strip in order to achieve the objectives of the war. They have been determined by the political echelon, including the release of all our hostages, the living and the deceased. The statement ends by saying Israel will act against Hamas with increasing military strength. Hamdah Salhut's joining us from the Jordanian capital, Amman. That's because Israel and the Palestinian Authority have both suspended Al Jazeera's operations in the occupied West Bank. Hamdah, we were just hearing there that the Israeli Prime Minister's office putting the release of the Israeli captives still held in Gaza, both living and dead, at the center of these attacks. And yet, of course, we have seen tremendous pressure over the last several months from families and friends, relatives of the Israeli captives demanding their release.
Well, they've not only been demanding their release, but they've been demanding that the Israeli government enter into phase 2 of this deal, which would entail an end of the war, but also mean the return of all 59 remaining Israeli captives inside of Gaza. Hamas has said, and it's widely known and circulated within Israel, what Hamas has said, that on the first day of phase 2 of the deal, should it be signed, should it come into play, Hamas is willing to release all 59 hostages in one large exchange on the first day of that second phase. However, Israel does not want to commit to a second phase of this deal. In fact, they were largely stalling negotiations for the second part of the deal. They were supposed to come into effect on February 6th, which was day 16 of phase 1. It's a lot of numbers here, but the numbers are important in order to keep track of how we got here. So the ceasefire was signed into place January 15th. It then went into effect on January 19th. February 6th, 16 days later, that's when the negotiations were supposed to start for phase 2. But the Israeli Prime Minister did not send any sort of Israeli delegation to either Doha or Cairo to meet with mediators. But later, when the U.S. envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, came at the end of last month, at the end rather of the first phase of the ceasefire, he then pressured Netanyahu to send a delegation, but they were sent to several different places to no avail. The impasses were far too great. The gaps within what both sides wanted were far too big at that point. And according to anonymous officials within Israeli media, they're saying that those gaps could not be bridged, that what Hamas wants and what Israel wants are far too different in order to reach any sort of assessment. So the Israelis are saying that in light of Hamas not releasing the captives, that's why they've decided to resume the war and, quote, open the gates of hell on the Palestinians in Gaza. These are the words of the defense minister. But it's important to mention here that Israel did not want phase 2 of the deal, which could have seen the release of all of the remaining captives at once.
And Hamdah, I understand that there are expected to be large nationwide protests in Israel planned for the next few hours, I believe. There is some speculation about whether or not they're going to go ahead, but they are geared towards criticism of the way that the Netanyahu coalition has been handling the war in Gaza. There's a lot of domestic pressure, isn't there, on Benjamin Netanyahu?
You know, for about a year and a half, we've been reporting on the pressure that's on the shoulders of Benjamin Netanyahu that's coming from all different directions. But domestically, you have the Israeli public, the family members of Israeli captives. And it's important to note that Netanyahu is not exactly a popular figure within Israel. He's not really popular among the people, especially those who are protesting against his leadership, of course. So you have hundreds of thousands of people who are set to take to the streets this week week in protest of his leadership, in protest of his government. This is the most far-right government in Israel's history, one who says has received guarantees from Netanyahu previously that there would be this return to the fighting. And in fact, these plans, according to one Israeli official, were drafted late last week by the new army chief of staff and were given to just a small circle within the political echelon for approval. And ultimately, the Israeli prime minister gave the military the go-ahead in an effort to, quote, surprise Hamas in an attack in the middle of the night to try and even put more pressure on them. But the army says that there are other things they have planned, meaning that they are planning to widen these attacks so that they're not just coming from the air, but similar to what we saw throughout the full siege on Gaza from land, air, and sea. But the protests, nonetheless, that we're going to see in Israel are going to be against everything, against the leadership of Netanyahu, against his far-right coalition partners, against Israeli military action in Gaza, and against the resumption of war as a whole, saying that it does not put the captives at the top of the list of those goals. But many within Israel believe that Netanyahu has long prolonged this war for his own personal and political gain, oftentimes putting aside the issue of the captives for selfish reasons. Those are the words of family members of those who are still being held captive in Gaza. So there are going to be a lot of protests, hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets in all different parts of the country. And look, there were already large nationwide demonstrations planned for Wednesday for an entirely separate issue, also relating to Netanyahu wanting to fire his security chief, the head of the Shin Bet, known as the Shabak, the Internal Security Agency, because he says he doesn't trust him. But this is the same person who said that he's going to be carrying out his duties and position until all of the captives are brought back to Israel. So there's a lot of internal discourse and turmoil within Israel itself right now, and this is surely going to cause it to further escalate within the Israeli public and the protest movement itself.
Salhut in Amman, thank you very much indeed.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.